Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction, I think, Claire. My job this morning really is to take you through some of the data that we've generated in HCCA's fungicide performance work on wheat and barley this year. And as Claire said, to put that really into the context of the data that we've collected over now a great many years of this work. So, I'm going to start with the wheat work, and the wheat is delivered by a partnership of ADAS, NIAB and SRUC, funded by HCCA, and also Chuggers, who fund and deliver a trial in Ireland. So we have, as you know, in this project, we have a great many trials, so I've just really tried to summarise those on all this first table. We're running 6 Septoria trials. 2 of those in Scotland, and that's a single spray T1 trial with an application at sort of gross 32, leaf 3, and then a single spray trial at T2 at flagleaf. We have the same setup at Sutton, Scotney and Hampshire, so that's 4 trials in total now. We have a timing trial at Roseman in Herefordshire, which is a slightly different design, but does include a dose response curve at leaf 2, so sort of intermediate between T1 and T2. And there's also a timing element, but that's really what Neil will be covering a bit later. And then we have, again, a trial that's sprayed at the leaf 2 timing in Ireland. And then we have a single yellow rust trial sprayed at T1 and a single brown rust trial which is sprayed at single timing at T2. And we've taken a slightly different design for that this year. We've actually inoculated that trial for the first time in order to try and generate some higher levels of disease. And finally, there is a powdery mildew trial, which actually in 2014 didn't generate any powdery mildew, but we did get some Septoria data, and that's actually been added into the over-trial analysis. Now, in 2014, as Claire was saying, we had some tremendous disease pressure, and that means we've really created a tremendous amount of data from this year. And unfortunately, in 45 minutes, I can't share all of that with you, but I will do my best to give you some highlights, if you like, from 2014, and then to show you some over-trial and over-year data. Also, just to point out that as well as collecting the disease data, we do take the opportunity to collect yield data and quality data. And again, I'll show you bits and pieces of that as we go through. Okay, so let's start with the Septoria work then. So as you know, we have a range of products that we compare with untreated. And all of the trials obviously have that untreated in them. And all of the trials also have our standard, which is Ignite or Opus Max, epoxyconazole, full dose of 1.5 litres. And then a series of other products included. So Proline is included in most of the trials, but not in the timing trial. And the full dose of that varies, obviously, because in Ireland they have a slightly different concentration product to we do in the UK, but that's all balanced out in the trial design. Then we have some protectants. We have Phoenix, Volpet. We have chlorothalonil, Bravo. And Bravo is only included in the trials at a single dose. And that's actually a half dose, or 1 litre per hectare dose. And you'll see that as a single point on the curves, on the graphs rather than a curve. Then we have a couple of straight SDHIs, Imtrex, fluxperoxide and Vertisan. And then 3 sort of SDHI azole mixtures, either formulated products or tank mixes, Aviator, Adexar and Vertisan Ignite. So that's our sort of core product range for the Septoria trials. Now what I'll do is I'll take my time with this first chart just to go through the sort of design of the chart so you know what they all look like, and they'll all be the same pretty much from this point on. So I'll take you through bit by bit. I hope you can see this on the far screen the other side. At the bottom here, you have got you've got the dose as a percentage of the full label rate. So that goes up from 0 to 200%. So in other words, 0 up to double dose. And as you know, we generate data from a number of points on that dose range. So a 25% dose, a 50% dose, 100% dose, and a 200% of the full label rate. Now, in your handouts, you'll notice that the scales only go up to 100%. So in the handouts, we have cut the charts off at 100% mark. That's partly just to remind you that obviously you cannot apply more than 100% in practice in your treatments. We use the 200% obviously to enable us to plot the curves. Now the other thing to point out is that we have 2 charts on each slide. They are the same trial. It's just that if we put all the lines on one chart, you won't be able to see the difference between the lines. So we split the lines up between 2 different charts just to make it easier for you to see, but they are the same trial. On the y-axis, we have whatever we're measuring. So in this case, it's the percentage Septoria. And then you have your products. You've got your various points, and then we plot the curves that you see in colour there to those points. So the first chart I'm going to show you is some Septoria data from 2014. This is from the timing trial in Hereford. And I've chosen this trial because it had some very high levels of Septoria and generated some good protectant data. So I'll take you through what we've got here. So we have, first of all, our Ignite treatment, which is in the brown there, giving us our usual dose response. So that's our, if you like, our standard treatment. Then we have our first of our multi-sites, the Bravo. Remember that's a single point. So you can immediately see that chlorothalonil, the older product, still doing a very, very good job in terms of Septoria protection and outperforming the azole standard. Then we have some of our SDHIs. So these are straight SDHIs we've got here, Imtrex and Vertisan at the bottom here. Not a lot to choose between those two products and giving a better performance than the azole and outperforming also the chlorothalonil. A word of caution now, and I'll repeat this later, although we are testing straight SDHIs, that is clearly not how they are used in practice. We always use the SDHIs in mix with an appropriate partner. But obviously we're testing them here as straights to understand their strengths and weaknesses. So here's our straight SDHIs. And finally, on this trial, we haven't got Proline in this trial, but we do have Seguris, and so we've put Seguris on this line here. Now, on the chart on the left-hand side, you've got our main SDHI azole mixtures, our Aviator, Edexar, and Vertisan Ignite. What you'll see with those three is they are very, very close in terms of their performance. There's really no difference in terms of how effective they are in this protected situation. And in fact, if you compare across to the Seguris line, you can also see that the Seguris line is comparing very favourably with those other three SDHI azole mixtures. Okay, so let's move on to look at, if you like, the over trial analysis from 2014. So we've got 6 trials in 2014 where we were able to generate some data on protectant activity against Septoria. So in this over trial analysis, there's a slight change in what I'm showing here. We've now got Proline in because that was in the 6 trials, and Seguris is not in this one because it wasn't in most of the trials. So let's have a look as we go through. There's our Ignite standard. There's our Proline line. There is our Phoenix, our protectant treatment. So you can see the Phoenix giving us a reasonable level there of Septoria protection, a nice sort of response there. But when you compare it with the chlorothalonil, you will see that obviously it's not performing quite to the level of the chlorothalonil, but it is giving us a useful level of protection. Finally, we've got our 2 SDHI products, the straights, the Imtrex, and the Vertisan. As in the example from Hereford, they are very, very closely matched. Now, one thing you will be looking at is the difference between the Ignite and the Opus Max, Ignite, Opus Max, and the Proline line. And I'm going to come back to that on my next slide, so just bear with me for that one in a moment. And then on the other slide over here, you've got your 3 SDHI azole mixtures, and as we saw with the performance on the Hereford trial, they're very, very closely matched in terms of their protectant performance. So I sort of come back to the performance of Proline and Opus in comparison in this slide and the next one. Now, as you see there, obviously the Proline is giving us a better performance this year in terms of a protectant activity than the Opus. And those 2 products, if you look back over time, as I will do later on, have gone from year to year, do vary in their relative performance. On average, they come out very similar, but we do see some seasonal variation. And in all of the trials this year, we did see an advantage to Proline over Opus, or over Ignite rather, Opus Max, in terms of their protectant performance. But that's sort of in line with the sort of variation we get from year 2 we've seen previously. Now, I haven't been able to really explain why we've had that difference in performance. It is appeared to be a seasonal effect, but as yet we haven't been able to define exactly what that is. And we don't think at this stage that it's indicative of any particular shift, because we've seen that pattern before. Okay, so now looking over the over-year data. So we have all the trials now over the last 3 years put together on this particular set of data. So again, if you look at our over-year performance of our Ignite Opus Max against the Proline, you can see they're much closer in over-year performance, and that's because in 2012 and 2013 they were more similar. We also have our Phoenix, and again, showing in a good level of protecting activity over the 3 years, but again, not up to the level perhaps of the azoles or indeed the SDHI straights at the bottom there. So our SDHIs, our comparison of Vertizan and Imtrex, very closely matched again in terms of their performance. And also looking at the SDHI azole mixtures on this side, we've got Seguris back in here again now. All those 4 products really very, very closely matched in terms of their protectant activity, giving us good levels of control, better than the azole components, and also giving some advantage over the straight SDHIs as well. Okay, so that's the Septoria protectant activity. As you know, we test products separately as protectants and eradicants by looking at the leaf layers in which we're getting control. So this is now the eradicant activity. I've moved straight to the 4 trial mean data. So 4 trials in 2014 gave us eradicant data. Let's start again on this side. Now, the first thing you'll notice probably is that the lines look much closer than they did on the protectant slides. But part of the reason for that is because the axis, we've got a much bigger range on the axis. These go up to 0 to 40. So my previous slides only went to 0 to 20. So actually, there's some big differences nevertheless between the lines. Now, another thing you'll notice here, Proline Ignite, you won't even be able to see the Proline line very easily because it's actually underneath the Ignite line. So in terms of eradicant activity in 2014, there was no difference between the products. So no difference in there. And again, if you look at the straight SDHIs, the Imtrex and the Vertizan, again, relatively similar performance, but once again, better than either of the 2 azole treatments. On the left-hand side, we have our 3 SDHI azole mixtures again, and as we saw with the protectant activity, they're all performing very well compared to the single actives, and they are all giving relatively similar levels of performance against Septoria in terms of eradicant performance. So moving on to Septoria eradicant in terms of over-year data. And once again, looking at the performance of Proline and Ignite Opus Max, very, very similar performance, more or less on the same line. Looking at the 2 SDHIs, again, as we saw previously, they're outperforming the azoles, but there's a slight bit more differentiation between the 2 SDHIs when you look at the over-year, with the Imtrex showing some advantage over the Vertizan as a consequence of the results we had in the previous 2 years. And then looking at the performance of the SDHI azole mixtures on this side, something slightly different on this one. I've now put a Seguris back into this chart because it was in previous years. And you can see, although there's not much difference between the Aviator, the Adexar and the Vertizan Ignite in terms of their eradicant activity, as we've mentioned to before on this platform, the Seguris is slightly weaker in an eradicant situation. So it compares quite well as a protectant, but it is the weaker of the 4 in an eradicant situation. Now, a lot of what we do in fungicide performance work is to get data on levels of disease control, but we also do take the opportunity to get some yield information. And just a caution really, these are single sprays typically, and therefore not representative of the yield responses you might expect to get in a full program on farm. But nevertheless, I think they can contribute something useful to our understanding of how the products perform. So I've selected one slide from 2014, which is actually the Hampshire T2 trial, to show you the sorts of yield responses we're getting for the different products in that situation. And you can see that we got some very good yield response in this trial, untreated around 7.5 tonne, right up to as much as 11.5 tonnes, so 4 tonne response from a single spray of the most effective treatments. You'll also see that obviously now, because the yields are up the other way, effectively the lines are going up the other way, so the higher up the better, obviously, unlike with the disease. And our rank order of products is relatively similar, but they do space out a bit more. And in particular, if we look at the top here, between our 2 SDHIs, the Vertizan and the Imtrex, in terms of protectant activity and eradicant activity, if you remember from the last slides, they were pretty close. But when it comes to the yields, they have broken apart a little bit more. And the Imtrex showing more of an advantage over the Vertizan. And you'll see in a moment that that applies across more than just this one trial. And I'll come back to why that is in a moment. So that's the first thing to point out. In terms of the yield performance, well, not surprisingly, with the weaker protectant activity that we saw from the Opus Max Ignite in 2014, that has translated through to a slightly poorer yield response compared to the Proline this year. And also we're getting some yield response from the Phoenix, again in line with its Septoria control, not to the level of some of the other products. And again, a good performance from the Bravo in terms of its yield, exceeding that of the azoles, but not quite up to the level of the straight SDHIs. Looking at the yields also from the SDHI azole mixtures, not surprisingly, the Aviator and the Adexar very, very closely matched as they were in terms of Septoria control. But once again, the Vertizan Ignite yield response not quite as good as the other two SDHI azole mixtures. And if I take you on to the over-trial summary of yields for 2014, so that's 7 trials that have gone into this matrix, you will see that, the relative position of the curves is very similar to the one I just showed you for Sutton Scotney. So we have that differential between the Proline and the Ignite there, which mirrors the levels of Septoria protectant activity. But again, we also have this differentiation between the Imtrex and the Vertizan. And we also have the differentiation between the Vertizan Ignite and the other two SDHI azole mixtures. So despite the fact that the levels of Septoria control were quite similar that we saw in the other charts, the yields are slightly more separated. And we've tried to understand and look at why that is, but it does appear that the persistency of the effect of the Vertizan or the Vertizan Ignite treatments was a bit shorter than it was for the other SDHIs, and therefore some of the greenleaf data is showing a sort of quicker decline in the greenleaf area for the Vertizan treatments than from the others. So that obviously doesn't show on the Septoria control data, which is, if you like, your initial assessment, but by the end of the season, it's perhaps running out of steam a bit quicker this in 2014, and that may explain why we got the slightly poorer yield responses. I should say that if we look at the yields over years, which I haven't got a slide in, didn't have time to put that one as well. Two things if you look at the yields over time. Firstly, the Opus Max Ignite Proline lines become much closer. The two products compare much more favourably over years because the performance was better in 2012 and 2013 from the Ignite. And secondly, the Ignite Vertizan yields were compared more favourably with the other SDHI azoles if you look over years, again, because the performance was better in relative terms in the previous 2 years. Now, the other thing that we do with the fungicide performance work is to look at how the performance of products changes over time, as well as comparing the products within single years. We've been doing that for the azoles. As you know, we have this shift in terms of azole sensitivity, in terms of Septoria sensitivity to the azoles, which we've been monitoring through the data over years. What we do basically is for the Ignite and for the Proline, we've taken the average level of control we've had with each product in the fungicide performance trials and plotted that on some charts over time. So on this left-hand chart, we have the average level of Septoria control achieved with Proline or Opus stroke Ignite. Obviously, we changed from Opus to Ignite formulation partway through this time, and compared those for how they compared over time. So we have our Opus Ignite blue squares, our Prolines, which are clear triangles. And there's a few things to point out about this. First of all, you've got your, as we've already referred to, the relatively poorer control from Ignite in 2014 in terms of this protectant activity. This is the protectant activity I'm showing here. And that reflects what you saw on the previous slides. But just to point out, that same sort of differentiation we have seen before, back in, I think, 2003 there. And just to point out that that wasn't showing in subsequent years. So again, just a caution about reading too much into that single year data. The other thing you will notice, those that have seen these charts before, is previous years we've tended to plot separate lines through that data, one for the Opus Ignite and one for the Proline. But actually we've looked at that statistically and there's no justification for doing separate lines. We can explain much more of the variation by pulling a single line through all the data. So in other words, the decline is the same for both products. And that really just highlights the issue that we've got now, is this declining performance in protectant activity, both at the half dose and indeed a decline at the full dose, although slightly shallower. Now we can put the similar data on an eradicant chart. So this is exactly the same, but now looking at eradicant activity, our half dose and our full dose data. Again, we've plotted a single line through both the azole products, no justification for two different lines. Now, what I want to point out here is this. So this is the 2014 eradicant activity at half dose and full dose. There's actually 2 points there because the Proline and Opus Ignite values are on exactly the same place. The level of control, remember, in eradicant was exactly the same in 2014. But you will also notice that it sits above the line. And you may be wondering, what's going on there? So I really need to explain what we do when we collect our eradicant data in order to explain that position at that point. So each year when we collect our eradicant data, we assess a number of leaves below the treated leaf layer in order to get our eradicant data. Most years it's usually perhaps 2 or 3 leaf layers below the treated leaf layer. And if you imagine that third leaf layer, for example, below the treated leaf layer, the disease on that, some of the disease on that would have been established long before we put our treatments on. So we were never going to control that disease with anything. So we always end up with, if you like, relatively poorer control further down the canopy because it's so much before we actually put the treatment on. Whereas leaf layers further up the canopy, it's more likely we'll be able to get control with eradicant control because it's closer to the time of having treated. Now, in 2014, the lower leaf layers were so far progressed in terms of disease that we had to exclude them from the assessment. Basically, if they have more than 70% disease on the untreated, we can't really use them. So in 2014, the assessment of eradicant performance is really only the leaf layer below the one that was treated. So that immediately gives the 2014 data a bit of a flip up because obviously that's much closer to the time of treatment. So don't read anything into that in terms of an upward shift in eradicant performance. It's simply a consequence of what leaf layers were assessed in that particular year and in fact basically a slightly easier test because it was only the one leaf layer below the treated layer. But the basic picture there is that we've still got this decline in azole performance. It's why we are interested in what all the other products can bring to the pit party, the multi-sites, the use of the SDHIs, etc., because we know that decline is continuing. Okay, so far I've given you quite a lot of data on the Septoria side, and now I want to move over to some of the other diseases. So this is the 2 rust trials. So we have a yellow rust trial, we have a brown rust trial, and again it's a similar situation. We have an untreated, we have our Ignite treatment as our standard, and then a series of different products that we're comparing. So we've now dropped Proline out of here and put in Comet, Paraclostrobin, so strobilurin as another standard treatment. Again, we've got a multi-site in Phoenix. Well, I would point out Phoenix is not on the yellow and brown rust are not on the label for Phoenix, but we are interested in what activity it has. We've got our 2 straight SDHIs again, the Imtrax and Vertizan, and then in this case we have our all four SDHI azole mixtures, the Aviator, Adexar, Seguris, and the Vertizan Ignite. So same treatment list for both trials. So I'm going to start with the brown rust trial, which was in Cambridge in 2014. And as I said at the beginning, that was actually an inoculated trial this year with the aim of getting some higher disease pressure. And I have to say that worked very, very well. And we did have some very high levels of untreated brown rust in the untreated, much higher than we've had in recent years. So it gave a good test of the products. So going through the products that we have, these actually are our Phoenix points, and as you can see, there's quite a scatter of points there. We couldn't fit a line or anything. Basically, we're not getting any control or any consistent control from the Phoenix in terms of brown rust activity. Here's our Ignite, which is our brown line. Here's our SDHI products, the Imtrex and Vertizan, and you'll see those are doing a very good job in terms of brown rust control, as good as or slightly better than the Ignite treatment. But the real star of the single actives on brown rust was the Paraclostrobin, was the Comet, giving us extremely good control of brown rust in this situation, more or less wiping it out at even at half dose. So, it's very clear that the performance of the strobes against brown rust is remaining very, very strong. Looking at our SDHI azole mixtures on this side, again, the products all doing a pretty good job, doing better than the straight SDHIs, adding also to the performance we got from the Ignite. The main difference there perhaps is that the red line, which is our Aviator, is perhaps slightly off the pace compared to the other three. Remember, Aviators has prothioconazole in it. All the other mixtures you've got there have got epoxyconazole in it. So that's really the difference you're seeing there. A lot of it is down to the azole that those mixtures contain. But all of them doing, again, a good job overall. In terms of the yellow rust activity, well, what we see very clearly with the yellow rust activity is the strength of the epoxyconazole or the Ignite here, remaining very, very effective, our most effective single active really against yellow rust in that set. Once again, the performance of the Comet was very strong. In this case, no better than the Ignite, but certainly doing a good contribution. Looking at the two SDHIs, the Imtrex and the Vertizan, you will see that compared to the brown rust, the performance of SDHIs was weaker on the yellow rust than the brown rust. So they are contributing something, as indeed was the Phoenix. Although we didn't get much on the brown rust, we are getting some reduction in yellow rust from the Phoenix. And the SDHI is giving us some reduction, but not to the level they were in the brown rust situation. Looking at the SDHI azole mixtures, again, we've got typically the mixtures that contain the epoxyconazole, the Vertizan Ignite, the Seguris, and the Adexar, giving us the better performance. The Aviator X-Spray, which is relying on the prothio component, more perhaps, again, a little bit off the pace there in terms of the yellow rust. I've got some over-year data for you for the yellow rust. And the story there is really much the same as it was with the single-year data. The only thing I've been able to include here now is the Pro line, because it wasn't in the 2014 trials, but it was in 13 and 12. So once you put the Pro line on, which is this light blue line here, you can really start to see why the Aviator performance is a little bit off the other SDHIs or mixtures, because compared to epoxyconazole, it is weaker in yellow rust, and that stands out in that over-year data. But again, the message is the same really. Ignite, epoxyconazole, very, very effective, and all the SDHI mixtures have got that in, again, very, very effective in terms of their yellow rust control. Okay, so some conclusions. Very high disease pressure in 2014, giving us good eradicant and protectant data, good yield responses for Septoria. Differences between Proline and Ignite really only seen in protectant activity, and we don't think that's anything indicative of anything serious in terms of shifts. Solo SDHIs, very effective on Septoria triticide, but a reminder, we have to use those in mix with effective partners. Very important that we do that. The SDHI azole mixtures, Aviator, Adexar, Vertizan Ignite, very closely matched for Septoria control, better than the solo SDHIs, but we did see the Vertizan Ignite in 2014 perhaps not quite performing in terms of yield, perhaps through lack of lesser persistence. And just a reminder, multi-sites like Bravo, Phoenix, clearly contributing usefully to Septoria control and remain an important part of the programme as protectants. Conclusions on rusts. Really, Vertizan Imtrex showing activity on both rust species, but really more effective on brown rust than on yellow rust, clearly. Phoenix, no effect on brown rust in 2014, but did show some activity on yellow rust, but just a reminder, it's not approved on the label for those diseases. Comet, remaining very, very effective on brown rust, and also pretty good on yellow rust as well, but really Ignite is the star in terms of yellow rust control. And just a final observation, if you look across all the data, the yields, the different diseases, it's clear that overall those SDHIs or mixtures are much more robust than the straight SDHIs, and that's another reason why we need to use them always in mixture. Okay, So in terms of moving into barley now, the barley is delivered again by a partnership of ADAS, NIAB, TAG and SRUC, funded by HGCA, and once again Chuggers in Ireland deliver and fund an additional trial. So we have again a range of trials in the barley programme. We have 3 Rhynchosporium trials. These again are single spray trials, 2 net blotch trials, single spray trials, a brown rust trial, a powdery mildew trial, and a ramularia trial. And all the trials except the ramularia trial delivered the target diseases. The ramularia trial didn't have any ramularia, but it did produce some Rhyncho and brown rust data, and some of that is included in the over trial analysis on the Rhyncho. Once again, we've collected some yield data and so on from those trials. So, as with the wheat, it was a tremendous year for generating data on barley, on fungicides on barley, and it's added hugely to our data set. So in terms of our barley trial treatments, similar sort of story to the wheat. We have an untreated. We have our standard here, which actually is proline, prothioconazole, not epoxyconazole Ignite or Apis Max. And as before, obviously it's a different concentration product in Ireland, which is why we've got the 2 different doses there. Comet was in the net blotch and brown rust trials, but not in the Rhyncho trial. Phoenix in the Rhyncho trial, but not in the other 2 trials. Our Imtrex, our Zulu, our Vertizan, our straight SDHIs there included in the Rhyncho net blotch brown rust trials, except Vertizan, which was only in the net blotch. And then our mixtures, Siltrex Pro, Adexar, and Vertizan Proline. Adexar wasn't in the net blotch trial because Vertizan was. Okay, so we have that range of different products in those trials. So we'll start with the Rhynchosporium protectant activity. This data is from Scotland. Start on the right-hand side. Whoops. So here is our Proline, so our azole standard, if you like, giving us, again, very good levels of Rhynchosporium protection, continuing to perform very well in that situation. If you compare our 2 SDHIs, if you compare our Imtrex and you compare our Zulu, you can see very clearly that the Imtrex is more effective in terms of Rhynchosporium protection than the Zulu is. If you look at the performance of the Phoenix, again, it's very scattered. There's no real level of control there, consistent control there. So disappointing in 2014. In terms of our mixtures, our SDHIs, our mixtures, our Adexar and our Siltrex Pro, as we've seen in previous years, very closely matched, giving us very similar levels of control. However, our Vertizan Proline in 2014 was a little bit off the pace in terms of the level of Rhynchosporium protection. And really, if you compare it with the Proline line this side, we don't appear to be getting much more control than we were from just the Proline. So that's Rhynchosporium protection, a single site. If we look at the over year analysis from that data, so that's pulling together all the trials over all the years. A few extra things to point out here. First of all, we've got the Proline performance, and again you can see that splits the performance of the Imtrex and the Zulu. Imtrex clearly as good as, if not slightly better than the Proline. Zulu clearly not performing to the level of the Proline. We've got our Phoenix here, and although we didn't get much activity in 2014, in 2012 and 2013 we did get some more useful Rhyncho activity, so there is a bit of a response there. I'll come back to the Vertizan line in a moment. Let's have a look at the mixtures on this side. And again, they're quite closely matched, particularly the Siltrex Pro and the Adexar. The Vertizan Proline compares more favourably when you bring in the 2012-13 data than it did when you just look at 2014, but it's still perhaps a little way off the other 2. And some of the trials over that time, 1 or 2 of the trials, did have straight Vertizan in there. I think if you look at the performance of the straight Vertizan, it is perhaps helps to explain why the Vertizan Proline mix compares less well than perhaps the Siltrex Pro or the Adexar. Clearly, it's not as strong as, for example, the Imtrex, or indeed even as the Zulu, based on that kind of limited inclusion. Some Rhynchosporium eradicant data. This is actually from Cardigan in Wales. And again, we've got our Proline standard here performing very well. We've got splitting, if you like, the performance of the Imtrex and Zulu. So once again, the Imtrex is the stronger of the straight SDHIs on Rhyncho compared to Zulu. Now, Phoenix is not really an eradicant product, it's a protectant product, but nevertheless we are picking up some reduction in disease where we've used Phoenix even in this situation. If we look at our 3 SDHI azole mixtures, it's a similar story to what you saw with the protectants, in the sense that the Siltrex Pro and the Adexar are quite closely matched, but the Vertisan Proline is somewhat off the pace in terms of its performance, not really showing much improvement over the Proline alone in 2014. If we look at the over-year data for Rhynchosporium, so over-year eradicant data for Rhynchosporium, again you can see that that we've got some reasonable level of, we've got some contribution in terms of control from the Phoenix, but compared to the products it's relatively effective. We've got the same pattern with Imtrex clearly better than Zulu on the Rhyncho, and split, if you like, by the Proline performance. And as we saw with the Rhyncho protectant data, if we look over years, the Vertisan plus Proline compares more favourably then with the Siltrex Pro XR than it does when you look at it just in terms of 2014. But clearly those mixtures, particularly the Siltrex Pro and XR, are performing very, very well in terms of Rhynchosporium eradication over that 3-year period. So that's Rhyncho. Moving on to net blotch. And this is a trial from Hymethorpe. We had 2 trials in 2014, but Hymethorpe produced the highest levels of disease. So here's again our Proline standard. And interesting, you see if you look at the SDHI mixtures, the straight SDHIs rather this time, all of them are as good as or better than the Proline. So in terms of their performance relative to the standard, the 3 SDHIs are working very, very well on the net blotch, and again, not perhaps that much to choose between them in terms of their performance compared to what we saw in terms of their Rhynchosporium. So they're all contributing very well. If you look at the Comet performance, clearly Comet's having some useful activity there, but some way off the pace that we were getting with either the SDHIs or the azole. As you know, we do have the F129L mutation in net blotch, which confers partial resistance to the strobilurins, and therefore we might not expect to get high levels of control from Comet, and we are getting some contribution, but not high levels there. In terms of our mixtures, Siltrex Pro and our Vertisan Proline, well, as you might expect from the straights, actually they're pretty comparable there. Remember, we don't have Adexar in this trial, so that's why it's not on the chart. But performance of those 2 mixtures is very, very similar in terms of net blotch. If we look at the eradicant activity from Hymethorpe, actually it's a very, very similar story to what you saw on the last slide. Perhaps the Imtrex pulling away a little bit more from the other SDHIs in that eradicant situation. But again, the 2 SDHI azole mixtures very, very closely matched in terms of their performance, in eradicant performance. And the Comet, once again, off the pace in terms of compared to the other straights. Looking at the over-year analysis, again, it's a similar story for the net blotch. The main reason for showing you this slide is I wanted to show you the Bontima result. Bontima wasn't in 2014, but it was in 2012 and 13. And you can see that the Bontima is performing very, very similarly to the other SDHI mixtures. And the important point about Bontima, of course, is it doesn't have an azole in it. So it does bring in some other chemistry, some saprodinol, and can match the performance of the other SDHI products, which are mixtures with azoles. So, brown rust. Now, we haven't generated any brown rust data on barley for many years, and so very fortunate, very lucky that we, this year, with some good disease pressure, we've managed to generate some good data to test the products. So here's our Proline 275 line. So Proline giving us a good level of brown rust control on the barley. But actually, looking at the two SDHIs, the Imtrex and the Zulu, and indeed the Strobel and Comet, giving us very high levels of brown rust control from those non-azole treatments. So we've clearly got a range of single actives there that have good levels of activity that we can utilise. And not surprisingly, the three SDHI azole mixtures, all giving us very good levels of brown rust control, and really nothing to choose between them. All the actives there, all the products, all the actives are working very well. In terms of yields, now when we look at yields from any of these trials, often we have a mixture of diseases in there. So as well as the brown rust in this trial that we were looking to test, we did get some net blotch in this trial as well. In terms of the single actives, there's not a lot to choose between the different products in terms of their yield performance. But I think the main thing I want to point out here is that the yields of the mixtures here are all giving us sort of quarter, half a tonne a hectare more than any of the straight products. So although the performance in terms of brown rust control is very good, again, it shows the benefits of using the mixture products and, if like, the foolishness of relying on any of the straights. Now, as well as yields, as well as disease, sometimes we can collect some interesting and useful other data, and I just thought I'd put this slide up because it's quite nice data. This is brackling from that Caythorpe trial, and you can see that all of the products are giving us some good reductions in brackling here, particularly really from the sort of SDHIs and the strobe here, and obviously the SDHI azole mixtures. So clearly there's a good link between the sort of levels of disease control we were getting and the levels of brackling reduction that we were getting. So just really a nice bit of data to show that these products are doing more than just disease control and yield. So the last of the many, many sets of data to show you is the barley mildew trial data. And that's a totally different data set to what you saw for the other barley diseases. Clearly we have some straight mildewicides in here. So we've brought in the cyflamid, the flexity, the Talius and the torture's mildewicides up against really our standard Proline, and also looking at some of the SDHI or SDHI mixtures, Vertizan, Zulu and Siltrex Pro. So just cautionary, this is only one trial, one data set, one leaf layer, so don't read too much into this, but nevertheless we did get a reasonable amount of disease on there, and we can sort of take away some useful messages from this trial. And I think that one of the key messages for me to take away is that, after all this time of having Proline using against in barley, we are getting still quite good levels of mildew control from proethioconazole, both from the straight product and also in form of sort of the Siltrex Pro mixture, SDHI azole mixture. So we're getting some very, very useful levels of control from the products that we're applying to control other diseases in barley. You will see that our straight SDHIs, the Zulu and the Vertizan, are doing something. They're not up to the level of the Proline clearly, but they are giving us some useful reduction in mildew. And you will also see that the data's a little bit noisy, so you can't really pull these lines apart, but effectively the four mildewicides are all doing a sort of a similar job there around the level of the Proline, and really with variation in the data we can't really separate them. I just say they're all doing a reasonable job. But the key message there is the usefulness of Prothio still in terms of barley mildew control. So, just some conclusions then. We've got more differentiation between the SDHI actives than we've perhaps seen previously in 2014. So Imtrex performing very, very well, especially on Rhynchosporium and net blotch. Zulu, very effective on brown rust, slightly less active on Rhynchosporium. Vertizan, again, less active on the net blotch than we saw with Imtrex. So really Imtrex is giving us a really good package across all of the diseases. Siltrex Pro, we've tested it a number of years now. It's been very, very consistent across all the range of barley diseases, but as in previous years, it's very closely matched really by Adexal or Imtrex, flux peroxide. Vertizan plus Proline was weaker on Rhynchosporium in 2014 compared to the other SDHI azole mixtures, and compared less well in 2014 than we've seen it in the previous 2 years. Not really sure quite why that should be, but it's just that 2014 data has shown. Comet, perhaps a little bit less effective against net blotch in the highest disease pressure site that I showed you. The lower disease pressure site, which I didn't show you, it did compare much better. But really, I think the key thing about the Comet is the performance still against the rust, particularly obviously in barley, the brown rust. Proline, very consistent with previous years, still giving us usual activity against mildew. This third year of data that shows that Phoenix is, well, I think relatively ineffective against Rhynchosporium compared to most of the other products we're using. There was a bit of activity clearly, particularly in previous years in the over-year analysis, but in relative terms it's not the most effective product. And I think the final message there is to avoid over-reliance on SDH and I and azoles. You know, other mixtures available. I showed you some data from Bontima on net blotch. We do need to make use of all the tools in the toolbox to avoid putting too much pressure on our two key groups, the azoles and the SDHIs. So my final slide really is not more data. It's just to tell you a quick look ahead for the fungicide performance in 2015. What's new? So the project starts a new phase this year. We have a new partner in our group, Harper Adams. Simon Edwards is joining us, but otherwise it's the current consortium is taking the project forward, which is now a single project. So we've brought together the oilseed rape, the wheat and the barley into a single project so we can look at complementarities across the programme. We've made some changes to the wheat. We've stuck with the inoculated brown rust trial format because it worked really, really well in 2014, generating us some very good data. And we've also introduced an inoculated fusarium trial for the new project. On barley, we decided to quit while we're ahead. Having generated the first barley brown rust data for several years, we decided to stop doing it, and we'll now focus our efforts on perhaps more difficult targets, more problematic diseases. And in particular, the resource that's freed up has allowed us to adapt another light leaf spot on oilseed rape. So a third light leaf spot trial on oilseed rape in the southwest to target what we know is a growing problem for many of you out there on farm. And that's it.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Stuart. A very comprehensive presentation as always. Very good.